Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about how to draft your own pattern for a V-neck sweater. You're going to be able to crochet this in any size using any yarn you want. So let's get started. Alright, so for today's tutorial, we're not going to talk about a specific stitch. I'm not going to show you a specific pattern. We are learning how to draft our own pattern using our own measurements, or the measurements of whomever it is that you want to make the sweater for, using any stitch and using any weight in yarn. So any hook or yarn combination you have, you can go ahead and draft a sweater this way. So this is the technique I use. So, hopefully it helps somebody out there. I will say right now that we are not going to be writing this pattern for a double-ended hook. That is a different technique because these are used to crochet in the round. So we're not going to be crocheting in the round today. It's going to be a flat fabric. So you can use this same method for Tunisian crochet using a corded hook. You can use a Tunisian crochet like aluminum hook like this one, or you can just use this for regular crochet. It doesn't even have to be Tunisian crochet. So other materials you're going to need are going to be a measuring tape. So you're going to need to take your own measurements. You need a notebook, a sheet of paper, something to write on. This is the notebook I use. I did create this myself. I'm very proud of it. I quite like it. If you want something like this, you can find it in my shop. I'll put the link down in the description box below. Otherwise, you can also purchase it on Amazon. So, that's available if you want that. So you're going to have to pick out a few different things to begin with. The first thing is going to be the yarn. So you're going to have to decide what kind of yarn you want to use and what kind of technique you want, whether it's Tunisian crochet or regular crochet. Pick out your stitch, and then we're going to have to move on to some of the measurements. So the very first thing you are going to have to take a look at is your stitch. So the stitch that you select, there are a few things that you need to note. First, you're going to have to make a swatch. If you start drafting your own patterns, it's just part of pattern making. Things you'll have to note is if your stitch tilts, because that's going to determine whether or not you're going to have to block your project before you sew it. You're also going to have to decide or determine, how many multiples you need. So if you have any particular multiple, you're going to have to note that. And you're going to need to note any row repeats that you have. So if it's a 1-row repeat, a 4-row repeat, whatever it is, jot that down in your pattern notes because that's gonna affect your sleeve a little bit later on. So when you make your swatch, I like to make kind of slightly bigger swatches, but typically what you would use would be a 4-inch square, or 10 centimeters if you're using 10 centimeters. That should give you about enough of an idea to get a feel for your fabric and determine if you have any sort of compression rate or shrink rate for your pattern, or for your stitch at least. The first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to make a chain. Now your chain can be, your swatch can be a 4-inch swatch. You're going to have to measure your chain, and don't measure it up in the air like this. Measure it against a flat surface and don't pull the chain because it's going to affect your measurement. So lay it as flat as you can and take that measurement and jot it down. Then you begin your swatch. Make several rows until you have your 4-inch square, and then measure the width again. There may be a difference in that measurement. So you might start with a 4-inch chain and then your fabric ends up being 3 inches. That tells you you have a 1-inch compression rate or a 1-inch shrink rate on your fabric that you're going to have to take note of whenever you're starting to calculate the width of your sweater. So don't skip the step. It's really important. I've skipped it before and I've had to redo sweaters, and it's, it sucks. All right. So you're going to need to take several measurements. The first one is going to be the shoulder, and it's not going to be like the shoulder width or anything like that. It's just the measurement between your collar and your shoulder, like where your shoulder ends. You need the width of one of your shoulders is all you need. I know there's probably a better term for this, but call it your shoulder. The next thing, you're going to need to take these measurements as a circumference. So these are going to be taken in the round, and it's going to be your shoulders, the bust, your waist, and your hips. You are going to use the widest of these measurements. But again, you're going to take these in the round. So it's not just from one shoulder to the other. It's from one shoulder around the other shoulder, around your back, and then back to that first shoulder. You're going to do this for all of the measurements. So you're going to do this for the bust, the waist, and your hip. Measurement I forgot to talk about, and I realized this when I was doing the Spanish version of this, is the length. So measure from your shoulder down to your hip. And do this at the front part of your body because it tends to have a slightly larger measurement than when you measure the back of your body. Next, you're going to take your arm length. So measure from your shoulder, yes, bend your elbow, and measure all the way down to your wrist. You're also going to need to take the circumference of your arm. So at the widest part of your arm, so flex like this, measure the widest part of your arm and then your wrist. Like I said, you need to take this as a circumference measurement. So make sure you measure around these parts of your body and not just, across. So both of these. Now, taking these measurements, we're going to begin drafting, the width of our sweater. So take whatever the widest measurement was. And this is between the shoulders, bust, hip, waist, whichever one of those the widest one was between all of those. This is going to be a very simple sweater pattern. So we're not going to deal with decreases to, make it a slim fitting sweater or anything like that. No, this is just very simple. So you're going to take that wide measurement and divide it by 2. This is going to give you your garment width. Your garment width is going to be not quite your initial chain measurement, but pretty close. So let's just say it was 36 inches. I'm going to divide that by 2. It's going to give me 18 inches. So this is almost your initial chain. So I labeled it as your initial chain, but there's a little bit more to it than that. So if you remember when we were making our sample that I talked to you about jotting down your compression rate, I tend to have a compression rate of 1 inch, but that's because I've been crocheting for a long time and I know this off the top of my head. It could be very different for everybody else, so make sure you make that sample and you jot down that compression rate. You need to add this to that measurement we just calculated. So that measurement, the width divided by 2, and you're going to add that compression measurement. So 1 inch is approximately 3 centimeters. I mean, it's 2.54 and it keeps going, but let's go with 3 centimeters. So if you're using centimeters, the process is the same, just use centimeters. All right, so the way we're going to construct the sweater is we're basically going to make one giant block for the vest. Your initial chain is going to be the width, and then you're going to add rows. That is going to make the length of your sweater. So you're going to make the front part of your sweater, and then we are going to use some decreases to create the shoulder panels and to create the V-neck. So you're going to start on this side if you're right-handed, or you're going to start on the left if you're left-handed. But the process is very similar. Then you're going to go ahead and close it off at the back and create your back panel. There are several ways to do this. This will really depend on what type of crochet you are working with, what type of stitch you're working on, and what your level of crochet is. So we're not going to go into it in this video, but if you guys want me to go into it at some point, let me know. I can probably make an entire tutorial talking about how to connect the different panels. But anyway, so this is how you're going to design the vest. It's just the simplest way I have found so far. All right. Now for these little shoulder panels, we're going to need to use decreases. Now the decreases, so I'm right-handed when I crochet, so I'm going to create this whole front panel, and this part of your front panel is going to measure about 3/4 of your garment length. So that measurement you took between your shoulders and your hip, that's going to be about 3/4 of that measurement. And then you are going to begin on the V-neck panel. So this is the first shoulder panel. Your decrease is going to be at the end of the row. You're going to decrease every row or every other row until you reach that shoulder measurement. So it's that measurement that we took between your collar and your shoulder, that one. So make sure that the length of this whole panel, so the front panel and this shoulder panel, measures that sweater length that you took. So from your shoulder to your hip. You're going to repeat this on the other side, but your decreases are going to be at the beginning of the row. So for this panel, it's at the end of the row. For the other panel, it's at the beginning of the row. So you're going to have 2 panels that look like this. And then you're going to create a back panel. Now, the easiest way, if you have very little experience with crochet, is to just create a rectangle. And that's going to be your initial chain is the width of your sweater and then the length. So just one giant rectangle, and then you stitch it at the shoulders. And there are several ways to do this, but I'm not going to talk about it in this tutorial. All right, something to keep in mind is going to be the multiples of your stitch. So when determining your stitch, remember that you have to do 2 shoulder panels. So let's say that your stitch is in multiples of 2. Because you have these 2 shoulder panels, you're going to have to crochet in multiples of 4. If your stitch is in multiples of 3, you're going to crochet the width in multiples of 6 so that you have 3 for this side and 3 for this side, and you can still crochet your same stitch. Now, if the stitch you're using has no multiples, then I highly recommend you use an even number of stitches, so multiple of 2, so that you have an even number on either side, and that way your shoulder panels match. All right, let's talk about row repeats. Row repeats may affect your sleeve decreases or the decreases of your neckline. So when I'm talking about row repeats, I mean there are some stitches that it's just you repeat row 1 over and over and over again. Like this one is a 2-row repeat. This one is a 4-row repeat. So here are the 4 rows, and then you're going to do different 4 rows, and you're going to repeat that over and over. So keep that in mind whenever you're designing your sweater, because this will take us into the topic of sleeves. So this is where that row count may kind of, it depends on your stitch. All right, so let's say the circumference of our arm was 15 inches. So once you've completed your vest, don't stitch it together yet. I found that is just easier. I did that in the last video, or I did something different in the last video, and it made it a little more complicated than it needed to be. Anyway, take your arm circumference, fold your measuring tape in half like this, and then just measure from the shoulder down towards the armpit of the sweater, and use a stitch marker, a safety pin, a piece of yarn, whatever you have, mark it. So mark that on your sweater like this. I'm going to use this flat piece of fabric just to kind of show you what that would look like, because I've already stitched this sweater close. So, all right, so here's the sweater, right? We've already determined where it is that we want our sleeve to end. So we've taken those 15 inches, divided them in half, placed our stitch marker. But since your sweater is not yet stitched like mine is, place a stitch marker on both the front and the back panel. Make sure that they both measure the same. So they should measure, that 15 divided by 2, whatever it was, 7.5. When you open your fabric, it'll look like this. The space between your 2 stitch markers should equal your arm circumference. So if that was 15 inches, that's what it should measure. Then you're going to have to decide how you're going to attach your sleeve to your vest. So there are 2 ways to do this. You can either crochet it directly onto your sleeve, or you can crochet the sleeve separately and stitch it on. So, whichever way you want. Here's a look at how the fabric looks depending on which method you use. So for this sweater, which I'll put the tutorial somewhere up here, for this sweater, I stitched it right onto the sleeve. As you can see, the space between the vest and the sleeve is kind of wide, but that's part of the design. So I wanted it to be a little bit wider and a little more noticeable. If, however, for your sweater, you do not want that spacing to be so big, then you're going to have to stitch your sleeve separately or crochet it separately and sew it onto your, onto the vest. So, pick whichever method you prefer and just go with it. It's going to be part of your design. So, think that through or try it out. You never know till you try it, I guess. All right, so the sleeves are designed as a trapezoid. So this right here is going to be your initial chain. This is going to be the widest part of the arm. So this is going to be the 15 inches. And then we are going to add length with every row until you reach the wrist. So let's talk decreases. So for your sleeve, if you want a narrow form-fitting sleeve, you typically want to do your decreases every 3rd or 4th row. This will vary by stitch. It'll also, you'll see. There's going to be some math involved, so you'll get to see that. But yeah, every 3 to 4 rows. If you are making a sweater that you want a sleeve that's a little wider, so just a more relaxed fit, then you would space out your decreases, and I typically do mine every 6 to about 8 rows. There is one sweater pattern that I did it every 12th row, but it was a really tiny stitch. Again, I'll show you how to calculate that here in a bit. If you're making this for yourself, the easiest way to figure this out is to just crochet it and try your sweater on as you go. But if you're making it for somebody else and you're using their measurements, you're going to have to swatch. So again, we get back to the swatching. But this is the best way to ensure you get your measurements right. I like to do 2 decreases when I swatch. So I just make a small one. I don't make the full sleeve. So this one is about 3.5 inches wide. At my first decrease, I go down to 3 inches. And at my second decrease, I go down to 2.5 inches. That tells me that each decrease, my fabric is going to shrink 1/2 inch. So, and this is a decrease on both sides. So it's a decrease at the beginning of the row and a decrease at the end of the row. So there are two decreases per decrease row. Wow. So I spaced out my decreases and I did them every fourth row. And as you can see here, that measures approximately 1.5 inches. Now your measurement doesn't have to be perfect. We are going to be doing some math, so get as close an approximation as you can. So it's about 1.5 inches. All right, now that you've got those measurements, I'm going to give you some measurements for a sleeve, and these are just random numbers I came up with. So this is just going to help us with the math process. So let's say our arm circumference was 15 inches, our wrist was 7 inches, and the sleeve length that we need is 24 inches. So once you have all of that, remember that jot down your 0.5 or your 1/2 inch decrease rate, and then the space between, I don't know how to describe it. The measurement between your rows, that was 1.5. We're going to use this here in a minute. All right, so we're going to take the arm circumference, so that was that 15 inches, and to that we are going to subtract the wrist measurement. That means our fabric needs to decrease by about 8 inches. All right, so now we're going to take those 8 inches. Now, if you remember, our our decrease rate for each of the decrease rows was 1/2 inch. So we're going to take those 8 inches and divide them by 0.5, which was that 1/2 inch. That gives us a total of 16. Now, what is this 16? That is the number of decreases you are going to have to crochet in order to get your sleeve from 15 inches to 7 inches. But we're not done. We still have to check this. So now, to make sure that our sleeve is actually going to reach the length that we need it to be, which was 24 inches, we're going to take those 16 decrease rows. We're going to multiply them by that space between our decreases for the length. So 16 times 1.5 gave us 24, which works out perfectly. But it doesn't always work out like that. That just happened to work out. I don't know why. So let's use a different example. Let's say the spacing between our decreases, instead of being 1.5 inches, was 2 inches. So if we were to decrease 16 times and the space between those decreases is 2 inches, that means our sleeve is going to be 32 inches long. That is a lot bigger than 24 inches that we need. So instead of decreasing every 4 rows like we did for our sample, we're going to decrease instead every 3rd row. This is going to create a smaller spacing between the rows. And instead of it being the 2 inches that we calculated for that second one, it's going to be a lot closer to the 1.5 inches that we would need. All right, now let's say we have the opposite problem. Let's say that we're using a really small thread, and that instead of it being 1.5 inches, that space between the rows is actually 3/4 inch. So to make the math easier, we're going to go with 0.75. So you're going to multiply your 16 by 0.75. And that's going to give us 12 inches. So if we do those 16 decreases, by the time our sleeve is 7 inches, our sleeve is only going to be 12 inches long. That's half the size of the sleeve that we need. So in this case, again, the math was a bit easy. That means we have to double the spacing between our decreases. So instead of making the spaces every 3/4 inch, we're still going to do 16 decreases, but instead of doing it every 4 rows, we're going to space those out and do them every 8 rows instead. Please note that this method is not perfect. It is just a guide. This is the method I use to calculate my sleeve length, or where I'm going to be placing my decreases. But, try it out, see what works for you. Now, the next thing here I'm pointing at in the video is just the finishing touches on your sleeve. So your cuff. You can use something as simple as just a row of single crochets or several rows, and then you can use, half double crochets. Once you've created the length of your sleeve and you've added whatever cuff it is that you want, you're going to stitch it, which is what I was showing you earlier, but I don't know why I showed it to you in that order. Anyway, you're going to stitch everything. So, you stitch the sleeve onto the vest of your sweater, and then you go through and you sew the bottom part of the sleeve. So I like to start at the wrist and then go all the way to the armpit right here, and make sure everything is lined up before you stitch from the armpit down to the bottom part of the sweater. But make sure you pin everything and that you pin it correctly so that you end up with nice and even edges. Like this one didn't quite work out. But once you've stitched all of that, you can start adding all the cute little trim things. So the hemline, the neckline, the cool little details that just make your sweater look fantastic. Again, use a variety of stitches. Just play around with different things. I like to use half double crochets and single crochets for mine, but that's because most of the time I like to pick kind of fun stitches, so I don't want the hemline or anything like that to take away from the stitch. Now, if you're going to be stitching in the round like I did for this yellow sweater, I just use single crochet and crochet that in the round. So the first one was kind of more of a tunic style. This one's more in the round. For the neckline, I just kind of went in a circle. This is all single crochet. So I just went around once for this sweater. And then this other one, because the stitching was smaller and I left more space for the neck. So the space between the collar and the shoulder was a little bit smaller on this sweater. I went around several times. But, that's all part of the design. So just play around with different stitches. And yeah, give it a go. But this is just a guide. This is the way I create my V-neck sweater patterns. It is by no means perfect. You can always improve on it. But make it your own. Play with different stitches. Try different things. Use the same stitch, but try different yarn fibers and different yarn weights. You would be surprised at how different a sweater will look, even though you use the exact same stitch. Yeah. Anyway, if you want to see more tutorials like this, let me know. If you have any questions, also let me know. That way, I can do this type of tutorial more often if that's what you guys want to see. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I will see you all in the next video.